If someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd be sitting here, writing this, I wouldn't have believed them. I was in love. Madly, deeply in love with my wife, Caroline. We met at a summer barbecue hosted by a mutual friend, and from the moment she spilled her lemonade on me and laughed like it didn't matter, I was hooked. Caroline had a spark, an energy that made everyone around her feel alive. She was everything I wasn't. While I, Daniel, was methodical, introverted, and more comfortable with spreadsheets than people, Caroline was spontaneous, adventurous, and a magnet for attention. But somehow we balanced each other out. She made me feel alive, and I gave her stability. Or so I thought. We married 2 years after we met. It was a small ceremony in the fall, surrounded by fiery autumn leaves and our closest friends. Caroline wore a simple white dress, her hair tumbling in loose waves, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. She looked like a dream, and for years, I believed I was living in one. Our life wasn't perfect, of course. No marriage is. Caroline had a flair for dramatics and a tendency to stretch the truth, but I chalked it up to her personality. She had a way of making life exciting, even if it sometimes meant things were chaotic. 5 years into our marriage, Caroline started feeling unwell. At first, it was little things, fatigue, occasional headaches. But then came the weight loss, the constant pain, and the doctor's visits that led to a diagnosis neither of us was prepared for. Stage 4 cancer. It was devastating. We were only in our early 30s, still dreaming of the future we hadn't yet built. The thought of losing her was unbearable, so I threw myself into being her caretaker. I took leave from work, learned how to manage her medications, and sat by her side during every grueling round of chemotherapy. Caroline, for her part, fought like hell. Even as her body grew weaker, she remained defiant, cracking jokes with the nurses and insisting that we still plan for the someday that felt like it was slipping through our fingers. She passed away in the winter, just after Christmas. I was holding her hand, whispering how much I loved her, as the light faded from her eyes. Losing her shattered me. For weeks, I couldn't bring myself to touch her things. Our house felt frozen in time, like she might walk through the door at any moment. Her scent lingered on her clothes, her handwriting was on sticky notes scattered around the house, and her favorite book was still open on the nightstand. It wasn't until 3 months later, when I decided to pack up her belongings, that I found the envelope in the back of our closet. It was a gray Sunday afternoon when I finally worked up the courage to go through Caroline's belongings. The closet was the last place I wanted to face. It held not just her clothes but pieces of her life that felt too personal, too sacred to disturb. Her favorite sweater hung on a hanger, the faint scent of her perfume still clinging to the fabric. I almost shut the door and walked away, but something inside me urged me to keep going. As I pulled down boxes and folded her clothes, I noticed a small, unmarked envelope wedged between 2 shoeboxes. It wasn't labeled, and for a moment, I thought it might be an old card or note she'd forgotten about. Curious, I opened it. Inside were several photos and a folded piece of paper. The photos were of Caroline with another man. They weren't innocent pictures. In one, she was sitting beside him at what looked like a cafe, her hand resting on his. In another, they were laughing, his arm wrapped around her shoulders. And then there was one that made my stomach churn. Caroline kissing him. My hands shook as I unfolded the paper. It was a letter, written in her handwriting. Dear James, I can't stop thinking about you. Every moment we spend together feels like an escape, like I'm finally living again. I know what we're doing is wrong, but I can't bring myself to end it. You've made me feel things I haven't felt in years. Please don't give up on me. I'll find a way to see you soon. Yours, Caroline. The room felt like it was spinning. I sank onto the floor, clutching the letter, my heart pounding in my chest. My Caroline, my wife, the woman I had spent years loving and caring for, had been unfaithful. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a close friendship. Maybe I was misinterpreting the photos. But the words in that letter were undeniable. She had been having an affair, and she had loved this man, James. Anger bubbled up inside me, mixing with the grief I thought I had already processed. How could she do this to me? To us? And how long had it been going on? I spent the rest of the day going through the closet, searching for more clues. I found another envelope tucked beneath a stack of scarves. This one was filled with printed emails, exchanges between Caroline and James. You looked stunning last night. I can't stop thinking about the way you smiled at me. I wish I could tell Mark the truth, but I'm not ready for that yet. Every time I leave you, it feels like a part of me is missing. Each message was like a knife to my heart. She hadn't just betrayed me physically. She had shared parts of herself, her thoughts, her feelings, with someone else. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I had stood by through sickness and health, had been living a double life. I spent the night in a haze, rereading the messages and trying to piece together the timeline of their affair. From what I could gather, it had started about 2 years before her diagnosis. While I was working late nights and planning our future, she had been sneaking around with James. The realization was like a punch to the gut. Even as she was dying, she had carried this secret to her grave. But I wasn't just angry at her. I was angry at him, James. The man who had been a shadow in my marriage, the man who had stolen moments with my wife while I was none the wiser. I needed to know who he was, and I needed to make him pay. Sleep didn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Caroline's face, laughing and smiling. Not with me, but with him, James. The name burned in my mind like a brand. Who was this man? How had he wormed his way into my wife's life, into my marriage? And more importantly, how could I find him? The printed emails provided some clues. In one of them, Caroline mentioned meeting him at a local art gallery opening. That tracked. Caroline had always loved art, and I remembered her attending a few openings alone, claiming I'd be bored stiff. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I trusted her. Now I felt like a fool. I started my search the next morning. I had his first name, James, and a vague sense of his interests from the emails, art, photography, and something about investment opportunities. It wasn't much, but it was a start. My first step was social media. I combed through Caroline's Facebook and Instagram accounts, looking for any mention of him. Nothing. She had been careful, almost too careful, to hide their connection. But then I remembered the art gallery. Took me hours of searching, but I finally found a local gallery's event page from 2 years ago. Among the comments was a photo album of attendees. My heart raced as I clicked through the images, my eyes scanning every face. And then I saw him. He was in the background of a photo, standing beside Caroline. She was smiling, her hand on his arm, and he was looking at her with an expression I could only describe as adoration. My stomach churned. The gallery's page tagged him in the photo, James Mitchell. I had a name and a face. Now, I needed to know everything about him. It didn't take long to find James's LinkedIn profile. He was a financial consultant who worked with high-net-worth clients, which explained the references to investments in the emails. His profile was polished, complete with a smiling headshot that made my blood boil. I also found his personal Instagram account, filled with pretentious photos of him drinking expensive wine, posing at luxurious vacation spots, and attending exclusive events. Caroline had liked a few of his older posts, which only confirmed what I already knew. The rage inside me grew with every new piece of information. This wasn't just some fling. James had been a deliberate, calculated presence in Caroline's life. I decided to dig deeper. I paid for a background check, something I never imagined I'd do. What I found surprised me. James had a clean record, no arrests, no scandals. But there was one detail that stood out: his home address. It was time to confront the man who had stolen my wife's loyalty. I drove to his house that weekend. It was a sprawling modern home in an affluent neighborhood, the kind of place I could never have afforded, even with my solid career. I parked a few blocks away and waited, watching the house from a distance. Hours passed before I finally saw him. James stepped out of the house in a tailored suit, carrying a leather briefcase. He looked exactly as I had imagined. Polished, confident, smug. I followed him. He drove to a downtown cafe, one of those trendy spots with overpriced coffee and minimalist decor. He sat at a table by the window, casually scrolling through his phone. My hands clenched into fists as I watched him from across the street. I wanted to storm in, to confront him right then and there, but I knew that wasn't the way to do this. If I was going to make him pay, I needed to be smart. I needed a plan. As I sat in my car across the street, watching James sip his overpriced coffee without a care in the world, I felt a surge of anger so intense it made my hands tremble. This was the man who had turned my life upside down, who had stolen the last years of my wife's loyalty. Confronting him outright would be satisfying, sure, but I wanted more than a fleeting moment of anger. I wanted him to feel the kind of pain he had caused me, but I couldn't rush it. If there was one thing I knew about people like James, it was that they thrived on their carefully curated image. The Instagram posts, the LinkedIn accolades, the smug confidence, all of it painted a picture of success and control. If I was going to hurt him, I'd have to go for what mattered most: his reputation, his connections, and his sense of power. The first step was gathering more information. I spent the next week following James, learning his patterns. He was a creature of habit, sticking to a predictable routine. He'd start his mornings at that cafe, spend his afternoons at a sleek downtown office building, and end his evenings either at a fancy restaurant or the gym. On weekends, he attended networking events, always surrounded by people who seemed eager to be in his orbit. I also dug into his financial history. Using what little I knew from Caroline's emails, I uncovered a series of shady business deals James had been involved in. On the surface, everything looked legitimate, but a closer look revealed patterns of manipulation. Pressuring small investors into risky ventures and walking away unscathed when things fell apart. It wasn't illegal, but it was unethical. And it was a crack in his polished facade. The second step was making contact. I created a fake identity, an alias complete with a burner phone, a new email address, and a backstory as a potential investor looking for guidance. It didn't take long for James to bite. His greed and arrogance were predictable. We arranged a meeting at a high-end lounge downtown. I arrived early, watching him walk in with that same smug expression that had haunted me since I found those photos. He shook my hand firmly, flashing the kind of smile that must have charmed Caroline once upon a time. "Always good to meet someone who recognizes opportunity," he said as we sat down. I forced a smile, pretending to be the eager novice looking for advice. For an hour, I let him talk about his expertise, his successes, and how he could help me turn a small fortune into a big one. Every word out of his mouth only fueled my determination. At the end of the meeting, he handed me his business card, confident he'd hooked another client. Little did he know, he had just handed me the keys to his destruction. The final step was setting the trap. I used the information I had gathered, his shady deals, his routine, and his contacts, to start dismantling his life. First, I anonymously tipped off one of his previous clients about the questionable practices in their failed investment. That sparked a lawsuit, something James clearly hadn't anticipated. Next, I sent the damning photos of him and Caroline to his closest professional connections, framing it as an anonymous concern about his unethical behavior. The photos painted him not just as untrustworthy in business, but also as someone willing to betray personal relationships. Finally, I leaked his involvement in a dubious investment scheme to a local journalist. The resulting article cast a shadow over his once sterling reputation, turning potential clients away and putting him under scrutiny. I didn't confront him directly, not yet. I wanted to watch him unravel first. And he did. Over the next month, his social media posts became sporadic, his confident demeanor replaced by strained smiles in the few public appearances he still managed. But the moment that sealed it for me came one evening as I was parked outside his gym. I watched as he stepped out, his shoulders slumped, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice, usually so smooth and self-assured, was tight with frustration. "I don't know what's happening, all right?" he snapped. "It's like someone's out to get me." He had no idea how right he was. Watching James unravel over the course of a few weeks was satisfying, but it wasn't enough. I needed to confront him, to let him know exactly why his life was falling apart. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about closure, about making him understand the destruction he'd caused in my life. I waited for the perfect moment, and it came on a rainy Thursday evening. I knew his schedule by heart at this point, and he'd always stop by the same bar after his gym sessions. I sat in the corner booth, nursing a drink, waiting for him to walk in. When he finally arrived, he looked different, tired, defeated. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a nervous energy as he scanned the room. He probably sensed his empire crumbling and didn't know who was responsible. I waited until he ordered his drink and sat at the bar before making my move. "James Mitchell," I said, sliding onto the stool beside him. He turned, frowning as he tried to place my face. "Do I know you?" "You don't," I said calmly. "But I know you, and I know what you did." His expression hardened, but there was a flicker of something else. Fear. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about." "You knew my wife," I interrupted, my voice low but firm. "Caroline." The name hit him like a slap. His face drained of color, and his mouth opened, but no words came out. For a moment, he looked like a man caught in headlights. "You remember her, don't you?" I continued, my tone colder now. "You were meeting her in secret, whispering promises to her while I was at home, clueless. You helped her destroy the life we built together." He stammered, but I didn't let him finish. "She's dead?" I said sharply, and his head snapped back like I'd hit him. "Cancer." I held her hand while she died, not knowing that she'd been sneaking around with you, that she wrote you love letters and kissed you in cafes while I was working my ass off to give her everything. The guilt on his face was palpable, but it wasn't enough. I didn't know she was sick," he muttered finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Of course you didn't," I spat, "because she didn't let you see that side of her. You got the fantasy while I got the reality. The chemo, the endless hospital visits, the sleepless nights." He looked down at his drink, his hands trembling. "I never meant to hurt anyone." "Bullshit," I said, my voice rising. A few heads at the bar turned, but I didn't care. "You didn't care who you hurt as long as you got what you wanted. And now you're paying for it." His head shot up, his eyes narrowing. "What the hell are you talking about?" I leaned closer, lowering my voice to a whisper. "You think all of this is a coincidence? The lawsuit, the bad press, the ruined reputation? That's me. I'm the one who exposed you, and I'm just getting started." He stared at me, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. "You're insane," he hissed. "Maybe," I said, standing up and tossing some cash on the bar. "But I'm a man with nothing left to lose. And you're just a fraud who's finally getting what he deserves." I turned to leave, but before I walked out the door, I glanced back at him one last time. He was still sitting there, his head in his hands, the weight of his actions finally crushing him. After that night, I thought I'd feel satisfied, maybe even vindicated. Watching James crumble under the weight of his actions had been cathartic in a way I didn't fully understand. But the truth was, the anger didn't leave me. It lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Revenge had been a distraction, a way to channel my pain. Now I was left with the raw wound of betrayal, and no amount of vengeance could stitch it back together. Over the following weeks, I kept tabs on James from a distance. The lawsuit against him gained traction, with more former clients stepping forward to share their stories of manipulation and deceit. The media coverage intensified, painting him as a con artist who preyed on vulnerable investors. His business contacts began to sever ties, and his social media accounts went silent. But it wasn't enough. I found myself driving by his house one evening, unable to resist the pull. The lights were off, the once pristine lawn overgrown, and the driveway empty. It was a stark contrast to the man who had once seemed untouchable. I should have felt triumphant, but instead, I felt hollow. What had I really accomplished? Caroline was still gone. Her betrayal still haunted me. And James, broken as he was, couldn't give me the answers I so desperately needed. One afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I wouldn't have answered, but something made me pick up. "Is this Daniel?" a voice asked, tentative and unfamiliar. "Yes," I said cautiously. "Who's asking?" "This is Rebecca Mitchell, James's wife." The words hit me like a freight train. His wife. Of course he had a wife. Why hadn't I considered that before? My silence must have unnerved her because she rushed to fill the void. "I found your number in some emails," she said quickly. "Emails between my husband and your wife, Caroline." I didn't know who else to call. Her voice cracked, and I could hear the pain in it. She was just as blindsided as I had been. Her world upended by the same man who had destroyed mine. "I don't know what you want me to say," I replied, my voice tight. "Just tell me the truth," she said, her tone desperate. "How long were they involved?" I sighed, leaning back in my chair. 2 years, at least. Maybe more. I only found out after Caroline passed. There was a long pause, and then I heard her sobbing quietly. It was a sound I knew all too well. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I had no idea. I thought we were happy." I didn't know what to say. What could I say? We were both victims of the same cruel twist of fate. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca and I spoke a handful of times. She told me about the life she'd shared with James, the lies he'd told her, and the carefully constructed facade he'd built. In some strange way, our shared pain became a kind of solace. We were both mourning people who had betrayed us, grappling with the realization that the lives we thought we were living had been a lie. One evening, Rebecca called me, her voice steadier than it had been in weeks. "I just wanted you to know," she said. "James is selling the house. He's leaving town." "Good," I said simply. But then she added, "And I filed for divorce." For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something like peace. After Rebecca told me she was divorcing James and that he was leaving town, I felt a strange sense of closure. Not the kind that immediately mends the gaping wound, but the kind that lets you finally exhale after holding your breath for far too long. James was gone, his life in shambles, and Caroline's secrets had been dragged into the light. Yet, there was still a heavy emptiness that lingered. I spent a lot of time reflecting on what I had done. Revenge had consumed me for weeks, and while it felt justified at the time, it hadn't filled the void Caroline's betrayal had left behind. I realized that the problem wasn't just her or James. It was the trust one had invested so fully in someone who didn't deserve it. That trust had been shattered, and I had to figure out how to rebuild myself. Around this time, Rebecca reached out again. Her divorce from James was moving quickly, and she sounded lighter each time we spoke, as if letting go of him was freeing her from some invisible weight. We started meeting for coffee occasionally, not as anything romantic, but as two people trying to navigate the aftermath of a shared nightmare. One day, as we sat in a quiet cafe, Rebecca said something that stuck with me. "You know," she began, stirring her tea absent-mindedly, "it's funny. I used to think James was my whole world, that if I ever lost him, my life would fall apart. But now that he's gone, I feel relief, like I'm finally free to be myself." Her words hit close to home. For so long, I had defined my life around Caroline. Her needs, her dreams, her battles. Losing her had left me untethered, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe, like Rebecca, I could find freedom in starting over. I started focusing on myself for the first time in years. I took up running, something I hadn't done since college, and joined a local trail group. It felt good to be outside, to clear my mind and push my body in ways that reminded me I was still alive. I also started reconnecting with old friends, people I had unintentionally drifted away from while I was consumed with Caroline's illness and later, her betrayal. There were still nights when the grief would hit me like a tidal wave, dragging me under. I'd sit in the empty house, surrounded by the echoes of a life I no longer recognized, and wonder how I could have been so blind. But those nights grew fewer and farther between. Slowly, I was learning to live with the pain instead of letting it control me. About 6 months after the confrontation with James, I got a call from Rebecca. She sounded excited, almost giddy, and for a moment, I didn't recognize her voice. "I thought you'd want to know," she said, her words tumbling out quickly. "James lost everything. The lawsuit, the bad press. It's all caught up with him. He's bankrupt, Daniel. He's completely ruined." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, to revel in the downfall of the man who had destroyed my marriage. But instead, I felt nothing. "That's good," I said finally. "He deserved it." Rebecca laughed softly. "He did. But you know what? I don't even care about him anymore. I'm just glad I'm free." Her words stuck with me long after we hung up. James was gone, his life dismantled, but I realized I no longer needed to think about him. My revenge was complete, and with it, the chapter of my life that had been consumed by anger and betrayal was finally closing. After hearing Rebecca's news, something inside me shifted. James's downfall was complete, and while it brought a sense of justice, I realized it no longer consumed me the way it once did. I had spent so much energy on anger and revenge, but now there was nothing left to fight against. What was left was the quiet, daunting task of rebuilding my life. I decided to start with the house. For months, I had avoided changing anything, clinging to the remnants of the life Caroline and I had shared. Her sweaters still hung in the closet, her favorite mug sat untouched in the cabinet, and her perfume lingered faintly in the air. But now, those things felt more like weights than memories. They weren't bringing comfort, they were keeping me trapped. One weekend, I took everything that had been hers, clothes, books, trinkets, and packed it into boxes. I kept a few things that held genuine meaning. A photo of us on our honeymoon, the necklace she wore every day, a handwritten note she had once left on the fridge. The rest I donated. The process was painful but liberating. For the first time in months, the house felt like mine, not a mausoleum for a love that no longer existed. I started filling the space with new memories. I repainted the living room, replaced the furniture, and hung up photos from my solo hikes and new adventures with friends. Slowly, the house began to feel less like a reminder of what I had lost and more like a symbol of what I was building. Rebecca and I stayed in touch, though less frequently as time went on. She was thriving. She had sold the house she shared with James and moved into a cozy apartment downtown. She'd started her own business and seemed happier than ever. "Do you ever think about dating again?" she asked me one afternoon as we caught up over coffee. The question caught me off guard. I hadn't considered it, not seriously. The idea of letting someone into my life after everything that had happened felt daunting, almost impossible. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm not sure I'm ready for that yet." She smiled knowingly. "You will be, when the time is right." As the months passed, I found myself thinking less about Caroline's betrayal and more about the lessons I had learned from it. Trust was fragile, and love wasn't always enough to keep a relationship intact. But I also realized that her actions didn't define me. Yes, she had betrayed me, but I had survived. I had rebuilt. I started journaling, pouring my thoughts onto paper as a way to process everything. Writing about my grief, my anger, and even my moments of clarity helped me make sense of it all. Over time, the pain became less sharp, less overwhelming. It didn't disappear, it never would, but it became something I could carry without it consuming me. One day, while out on a hike, I stopped at a clearing that overlooked the valley below. The sun was setting, casting the landscape in hues of orange and gold. As I stood there, breathing in the crisp air, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. For the first time since Caroline's death, I wasn't thinking about her betrayal or James or what could have been. I was simply present, alive in the moment, and that was enough. The peace I found on that hike stayed with me, a quiet but steady presence that reminded me I had come through the worst and survived. It didn't mean everything was perfect. There were still days when the memories crept in, when the weight of what I had lost felt unbearable. But those days were becoming fewer and farther between. I began focusing on the future, not the past. I started volunteering at a local community center, teaching basic tech skills to underprivileged teens. It gave me a sense of purpose and reminded me of the importance of building something meaningful. Through my work at the center, I met people who inspired me with their resilience. Single parents working multiple jobs, teenagers determined to carve out a better future despite overwhelming odds. Their strength gave me perspective. My pain was real, but it wasn't insurmountable. One afternoon, while packing up after a class, I struck up a conversation with another volunteer named Hannah. She was smart, funny, and refreshingly honest. A stark contrast to the life I'd known with Caroline. We talked about everything from favorite movies to the best hiking trails in the area, and before I knew it, hours had passed. Over the next few months, Hannah and I grew closer. She wasn't trying to fill the void Caroline had left. She was simply herself. For the first time, I felt like I could let someone in without fear of being blindsided. One evening, as we sat on my back porch watching the stars, Hannah turned to me and said, "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" Her question caught me off guard, but I nodded. "Yeah, more than I ever thought I could handle." She reached for my hand, her touch grounding me. "But you're still here. That says something." Her words stayed with me long after she left that night. I was still here, despite the betrayal, the grief, and the anger. I had survived. And not just survived, I had grown. James faded into the background of my thoughts, a distant memory of a man who had caused me pain but no longer held power over me. Rebecca and I exchanged the occasional text, but her life had moved on as well. She was thriving and I was happy for her. Hannah and I continued to build something new, something real. It wasn't without its challenges. Trust doesn't come easily after you've been betrayed, but we were honest with each other in a way that felt liberating. Looking back, I realized the biggest lesson I had learned through all of this: betrayal doesn't have to define you. It hurts, it scars,